Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Noah Blaylock Show, where my goal is to abolish all government control of education. Today with me, I have my wonderful friend, Jacob Hibbard. And so let me introduce everyone to Jacob. So Jacob Hibbard is the founder of the Latter-day Freemen, a group of Latter-day Saint men and women of the rising generation who are united in their commitment to restoring, defending, and promoting liberty as taught by the scriptures, the founding fathers, inspired thinkers, and modern prophets and apostles. He is a graduate of Brigham Young University with a degree in political science. While at BYU, he was the founder and president of the Young Americans for Freedom chapter and the president of the College Republicans. Following graduation, he worked for the Leadership Institute as a regional field coordinator, overseeing the training and supporting of hundreds of conservatives and libertarian student groups throughout the country. He was the conference director for the Mayflower Promise Digital Conference, an event celebrating the 400-year anniversary of the Mayflower Landing and America's heritage of religious freedom. Currently, he is the grassroots director for Americans for Prosperity, Utah, and is preparing to enter law school next year. He is the husband to an amazing wife, Chloe, and two wonderful boys, William, 4, and Charles, 19 months. Everything there accurate, Jacob?
Yes, you got it all.
Awesome. And I think I just saw on Facebook, you just got accepted to multiple law schools. Which law schools were those? Remind me.
Yeah, so I'm applying to law school right now. I've applied to 3 so far, Notre Dame, BYU, and the University of Georgia. I've gotten into the University of Georgia and to Brigham Young University, and I'm waiting to hear back from Notre Dame.
That's awesome. So everybody just know that Jacob is a smart cookie. That's further than I could ever get. I looked at law and I was like, oh, that looks interesting, and I started seriously looking into it, and I was like, no, that looks super boring and dull. I'm not going to do that. All right.
I'm excited to be on with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thanks for coming. All right. So today's topic of conversation for the podcast will be, can conservatives support the government's involvement in Can conservatives support the government's involvement in education? And we will be reading through the law, which is an essay by Frederic Bastiat. I believe he wrote that in 1850, near the end of his life. But it's a great book talking about the purpose of government. So we're going to be going through that, looking and talking about the points in reference to the purpose of government and how that does or does not apply to education. All right. So we're just going to go through here and read bits of it and I guess talk about it a little and see what Frederic and Jacob has to say. All right. You ready, Jacob?
Let's do it.
All right, so opening page. And I'll let you know where I'm going. So first paragraph here. The law becomes the weapon of every kind of greed. So that's in his introduction there. So that should give you a pretty good forecast of what Frederic Bastiat will be talking about here in his essay. So life, faculties, production, in other words, individuality, liberty, property. This is man. And in spite of the cunning of artful political leaders, these 3 gifts from God precede all human legislation and are superior to it. Jacob, thoughts on that?
So what I love about how Bastiat starts this off, breaking down what makes up us as individuals, the idea that we have our lives, our faculties, our talents, and then the things that we produce with them or acquire through them, so property, and how these things come from God. And so many philosophies, both in Bastiat's time, but also modern, seem to believe that the existence of life, liberty, and property completely depend on the existence of other things or other people. It's the government that makes those things possible or that creates them and gives them to you. But Bastiat immediately points to God being the source of these rights. And that immediately puts, when we're talking about rights, it takes rights from being something that is just a legalistic concept that we can throw around and play with, to something that has divine origin, which automatically should make us more cautious in what we do with them, but also gives us the direction of whose laws we have to take into account when we interact with life, liberty, and property.
Thanks. And I believe there's an Ezra Taft Benson quote. I can't think of the exact quote off the top of my head, but I can paraphrase here. Probably won't do it justice, but he says rights are either come from God or they come from the government. If they come from God, then they're always applicable. They're inalienable, or they come from the government. And if we accept that rights come from the government, then we must also accept the corollary that they can be denied by government, I, for one, shall never accept this premise. Corollary. So that's a brief summary of that statement. So yeah, rights come from God, and if they come from government, then obviously they can do whatever they want, and they in turn turn themselves into God if that's their claim. So each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. And as we're talking about education, it came to my mind that some of this, a lot of it still applies to the minor themselves, not just the parents. Obviously, minor rights is a little bit of a gray area in the legal world. But I mean, they still have a certain degree of rights that they're allowed to express and exercise, even, in the younger stages of their life. For example, a child's being kidnapped, he doesn't say, oh, I don't have rights. No, he should fight and do everything he can to keep himself from doing that. And so when we have strangers who the only difference is they, have a government title and they say, we're taking your children and we're going to do what we want with them, then we say, oh, that's okay. Well, what's the difference really? The title that they were elected. Again, they're probably a little bit less nefarious in, the sense of comparing it to, a rando in the park, but still a stranger saying, I'm going to take your kids and teach them and indoctrinate them how I will. Continuing here. So thus the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness is based on individual right. Jacob?
So I think this is incredibly important insight from Bastiat, and I think it gives us as individuals a ready toolkit, I guess you could say, to evaluate things when it comes to politics. Because as he says right before he says that, each individual has a right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property. And so we know then that the natural law, or God's law, what he authorizes us as individuals to use force for, is to secure our rights. Mm-hmm. And if we're using force for something that isn't pursuant to securing our rights, we are using force immorally. And so when we as individuals create government, that collective right, as Bastiat calls it, that collective right is bound by the same moral laws that we as individuals have. Government also has to limit its activities, because all government activity is an expression of force. All of it has to be pursuant to securing rights. So if the government's going to do something, we need to ask ourselves, is this something that is this to secure rights, or is it not? Or is this something that's necessary to secure rights? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, most government activities, I'd say probably about 90% of our current government activities, go for things that are not pursuant to the securing of our liberties. When you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gives a really good list of things that the federal government is authorized to do, and all of them in one way or another are pursuant to securing rights. Mm-hmm. And when we look about education, is the government using force to take money from me or from my neighbor to provide education a use of force that secures rights? No, it's not. And I think it gives us a ready indication that government-funded schooling is an immoral use of force and outside the proper role of government.
Great. And also adding on to that, I always hear conservatives, and they're always so adamant and persistent on the points that government is for the securing of rights, and rightfully so. You hear them talk about healthcare is a very frequent example. You hear some of the big thought leaders talk about this, and others, think about it and agree with it. And like I said, rightfully so. If you want to say healthcare is a right, then that means you have to point to an individual and say, I have the right to force you to go through schooling, force you to do this job in the medical profession, this particular kind of doctor, this kind, and then I have the right to force you to attend to me. And so when you say healthcare is a right, that's what you're saying. You have the right to someone else's life because their time, their liberty because they have to forego any other thing to pursue this particular career, and their property, the money that they would have received otherwise. You're saying you have a right to all that. And so conservatives make the right standpoint that no, you do not have a right to healthcare. You don't have a right to someone else's time and to them to have to do a certain profession. And so it's time for conservatives to recognize you do not have the right to point a gun at someone else and say, you have to go become a teacher. Or if you're already a teacher, you have to teach my child. You do not have a right to someone else educating your child. You have the right to learn, to pursue an education, but you do not have the right to an education. And something that we hear a lot, a very common argument in defense of government education is, oh, we all benefit from education, so therefore the government should provide it. Well, the problem with that argument is it proves too much. And because you can apply that logic to other things. Well, we all benefit from having shelter. We all benefit from having food. So should the government be in charge of our markets, of our grocery stores, of our housing market? Because we all benefit from them, apparently. So that's, but, on closer inspection, after, 2 seconds of inspection, you see that that is a terrible line of argument. So even if you could make the case that public education was good, even by a little bit, which it's not at all, but, that's not what we're here to talk about today. Even if you could prove that, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter if they could provide a good service because they do not have the right to provide that service. So continuing here, it is the substitution of a common force for the individual forces. And this common force is to do only what the individual forces have a natural and lawful right to do, to protect persons, liberties, and properties, to maintain the right of each. So you can't have the law assuming something that the individual does not have the power and the right to do. I don't have the right to just drive up, say, I want your child. I'm going to take them to my facility, wherever I choose, for however long I choose, to teach them whatever I choose. I don't have that right. So we can't all collectively get together and somehow make that a right appear for all of us if none of us had it to begin with. Anything to add there, or continue?
No, I think you hit it on the head.
Okay. When successfully, we would have to thank the state for our success, and conversely, when unsuccessful, we would no more think of blaming the state for our misfortune. So once we have the government out of education, we will have no one to blame for our misfortunes but ourselves. But as it stands right now, we have every right to blame the government for just sucking at education, at any form of it. And here's the other thing too, they've been sucking at it for as long as they've been doing it, 180 years, almost 2 centuries. You think that's going to change in the next few decades? You think, I talk to people, they say, well, maybe they could do this, maybe they could do that. And my response is, maybe. Why didn't they do it in the last 180 years? You think you're really the first person to come up with that idea? And I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm saying the fact that there's people with these ideas previously while the government's been in control and that they haven't been applied yet for 180 years is a pretty good predictor that nothing significant is going to change for the next few decades. 180 years, that's, if anyone sucked that long, they would have been fired long ago. But 180 years, that's, I can't ever find a reason to justify that. Not anyway.
Well, even if it worked, though, as we've discussed, it doesn't matter because it's an immoral use of force. It doesn't work, but even if it did, it's still not a moral use of force.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, continuing here. But there is also another tendency, and this is under a fatal tendency of mankind. But there is also another tendency that is common among people. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others, and then skipping to under property and plunder. But it is also true that a man may live and satisfy his wants by seizing and consuming the products of labor of others. This process is the origin of plunder. Now, since man is naturally inclined to avoid pain, and since labor is pain itself, it follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. History shows this quite clearly. And honestly, I'm going to be calling out parents everywhere, particularly the mothers. And we've had all these results showing us how terrible public education is, and mothers and fathers still continue to send their children there. And, a lot of them are like, I'm not sure I could do this. And that's an okay, inadequacy to feel, because everyone feels inadequate, I think, when it comes to the things that we're pursuing and need to doing. I don't think there's many parents out there who think, oh, I'm just the best parent ever. I'm sure people, think, am I doing this right? Am I doing this okay? And, that applies to anyone in any kind of, way. I'm doing this job. Am I doing it right? Or I'm pursuing this goal. Am I good enough for this? But what people need to understand is the history here is that America was free of government involvement in education for a little bit. And these mothers had no credentials. They weren't government sanctioned, and they were doing it better than the government ever could. You look at homeschooling people today, the parents, again, typically mothers, they don't have any credentials or degrees, and they're educating their children way better than any of the teachers who have as many years of experience as they do, with all the degrees and certificates as they do. So, I talk with a lot of people about this, and a lot of times I hear, well, that'd be a lot of work. I don't want to do that. Well, so even if you thought it would be hard to do, it doesn't matter. You can't live at the expense of others because you want to shirk your own duty. When you became a parent, that's part of the responsibility that you take upon yourself. Anything to add there?
No, I think you really hit it well.
Okay. So this fact, combined with the fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the almost universal perception of the law. And something to be said here is, again, when people keep talking about, oh, maybe education could do this or could do that, the problem with, again, another one of the reasons why it'll never be good is because you got to look at human nature and take that into account, because human nature has led us to the crappy system we have today. Human nature has not, from centralization, from a few ruling the many, it has gone to show that they can't or won't care about your children from that position of power. And so when people say, well, maybe we could do it like this, the problem with that is you're now saying, what if in the future we make the calculation without accounting for human nature? The problem is government will always be run by people. So the moment you take that out of the equation, you've set up a fictitious fantasy setting that will never exist. So that would be my rebuttal to plenty of people who have ideas on how to reform the education system versus just getting rid of government involvement, is don't think for a second that you can change humans in a way they haven't changed for millennia.
I guess that's the difference between conservatives and progressives or leftists, is leftists believe the human nature is A, good, or B, perfectible, while conservatives rightfully understand that human nature is fixed and it is not good. And so we can't plan on, it's not the problem isn't that we don't have the right, is not that we don't have the right people running the system. It's the idea that human nature limits us to be only very good at certain things under certain constraints. And so it's that fundamental misunderstanding of human beings that leads people to thinking, well, if I could just be in charge of the education, I could fix the problems. And like you said, that's a utopian fantasy.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here to legal plunder defined. Are you looking at your computer for the essay? You have the same copy. Okay, so page 13.
I have the same copy you do.
Yep.
Yeah.
Page 13, legal plunder defined. But how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. And a reminder that property is God sanctioned. He sanctioned the notion and the concept of property when he said, thou shalt not steal. Things can and do belong to one person and do not belong to another. That is how thievery and plunder works. So for education, you look, and that's exactly what's happening. The government says, you have money, this child is without education, or at least, in the sense that if we don't provide it, we're making the case that you wouldn't have it. So we're going to take from you, your paycheck, you go to work, we're taking it from you and giving it to this child. It doesn't matter if you're related or if you know them at all. It doesn't matter if the child even cares. Nothing matters. They say, you have, they have not. We are taking from you and giving to them. So I would call that a crime. So next paragraph, then abolish this law.
It is a crime.
Then abolish this law without delay, for it is not only an evil itself, but is also a fertile source for further evils, because it invites reprisals. If such a law, which may be an isolated case, is not abolished immediately, it will spread, multiply, and develop into a system. And that's exactly what we've seen. A lot of conservatives today, they say, oh, what if we just had locally controlled schools? That's what happened when government first got involved. It was locally controlled schools. You know what happened? The state got involved. You know what happened? The federal level of government got involved. And now we have, the student loan crisis. So many students have so much debt that they're sinking in. Wouldn't have happened if government didn't get involved, because they wouldn't be handing money to willy-nilly anyone. And now we have students crying for student loan forgiveness. Again, give to me what I have not, what another person has. Give to me what is not mine. And that's what they're crying for. And honestly, I'm just going to put this out there. I'm not for student loan forgiveness, but honestly, I think it's time for student loan forgiveness. And this is why I say that. Conservatives are now waking up to the massive crime that government education has been. They've been taking from people from years and distributing it among people. That's socialism right there, people. I don't know if you've learned about it before. That's socialism. And now with student loan forgiveness, they're saying, well, wait a second, I'm not sure I want this. Well, you know what? When you've been allowing it for years, you've never spoken up against this. They've been taking your money for years, and now they announce that they're going to take more. I think, honestly, if that's what it takes to wake people up to that this is a fraud, that this is a crime, that this is thievery, it's plunder, then by all means, I'm for student loan forgiveness. If that's what it takes to get conservatives across the nation to wake up and say government should have never been involved in the first place, then I'm for it. Anything to add?
No, I no, you're hitting it really well.
Okay. So continuing, the person who profits from this law will complain bitterly defending an acquired right. He will claim that the state is obligated to protect and encourage his particular industry, that this procedure enriches the state because the protected industry is thus able to spend more and to pay higher wages to the poor working men. The present day's illusion is an attempt to enrich everyone at the expense of everyone else. That's exactly what's happening with government schools. Is you hear the argument, well, if we don't have government schools, then we won't be educated and society will just fall apart. So how did society form before government schools got involved? And here I need to make people aware that this isn't just something I'm imagining here, that the prior to government involvement in education in America, we were the most educated, literate society in the history of the world, not just like fairly or kind of in the history of the world. I got a few quotes here that I got one quote that I'll read, then you'll hopefully get a general gist of the idea. So this is from Alex de Tocqueville, again, back prior to government involvement in education. The American people will appear to be the most enlightened community in the world. The whole population, as I observed in another place, is situated between these two extremes. In New England, every citizen receives the elementary notion of human knowledge. He is moreover taught the doctrines and the evidences of his religion, the history of his country, and the leading features of its constitution. In the state of Connecticut and Massachusetts, it is extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person who is wholly ignorant of them is a sort of phenomena. So how did people, he walks around and that's his experience with people, is that they're that educated and knowledgeable without government involvement. And to find someone who didn't know these things was a phenomena. Today it's completely the reverse. You find someone who's well and perfectly acquainted with the Constitution, religion, the history of his country, that is a phenomena. And so when people make the case that we need education, government involvement in education, we'll all just fall apart. Well, no, it's been the opposite. The moment we got involved, the government got involved with education, it started reversing. We now have a population where 20% of the population is functionally illiterate, and over half the population ranks in the lowest two scores of reading on the national assessment performed by the government themselves. So it's not like they don't have the data. So this idea that we need the government involved in education is completely the opposite. We need them out of it. Anything to add?
Well, they just need more money, Noah. Don't you know? They're underfunded. They're not getting enough money. That's what they'll tell you, at least. When you look at studies in terms of spending versus educational output, the spending trajectory is constantly increasing, while test scores stay the same or go lower. So clearly, funding's not the problem here. But like Bastiat says, they want to defend their acquired rights. I think that the phrase "acquired rights" is really important because it outlines that when we talk about rights, we're not talking about positive rights or the idea that you have an entitlement to something of somebody else's. It's a freedom from the negative right.
Negative right.
And it does create a duty. All rights create duties in other people, but their duties to refrain from infringing or doing things that would result in someone's rights being threatened. Not, so like a right to education would mean that I have a duty or someone has a duty to provide it, which is absurd if you really think about it. I mean, that's slavery.
And that goes right into the next part here under legal plunder has many names. Now, legal plunder can be committed in an infinite number of ways. Thus, we have an infinite number of plans for organizing it: tariffs, protections, benefits, subsidies, encouragements, progressive taxation, public schools, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed profits, minimum wages, a right to relief, a right to the tools of labor, free credit, and so on and so on. All these plans as a whole, with their common aim of legal plunder, constitute socialism. Again, socialism leads to communism. Again, a reminder to the conservatives and libertarians out there and any right-wing people listening here, the 10th plank of communism, again, communism has the 10 planks that constitute basically its philosophy. The 10th plank is free public education. So conservatives have to reckon that that is a communistic idea. And if you want to say you still support it, then okay, but don't look away and say it's not a communistic principle. It is. If you look at a Venn diagram, the overlap between conservative and communism is public education right now. So I'm going to say this again and again and again. I'm going to hammer it into all y'all's head until y'all are sick of it. Government involvement in education is socialism. Government involvement in education is socialism. Redistribution of wealth, the claim of false rights. Conservatives, this is no different than the healthcare that y'all complain about the government being involved in or any other thing. We all talk about this socialism sucks. Well, stop supporting it. Stop giving it your support. Stop saying, okay, stop handing your children over and being okay with it. It is not okay. Not in any way, shape, form, any universe. Doesn't matter. Whew. Anything to add to that?
I mean, it's true. And that's the problem is that it's once you give the state the control over education, what are they going to teach kids? They're not going to teach kids that government shouldn't be involved in education because that would destroy their jobs. And so right now we have all the incentives within the public education system towards more government and more government control. And more going to teach the proper role of government because that would lead you to the conclusion. Yeah.
It froze up a little. I'll just edit that out. If you can just start over what you were saying.
Yeah. So I think that conservatives need to understand that the schools have zero interest in teaching your children about the proper role of government. Because if you understand the proper role of government, you'll realize that their job, their existence as an institution is immoral and is wrong. And so you can't, if you want to stop the spread of socialism, you have to go after the schools because they will always be teaching our children to go the direction of socialism and communism. You'll always be playing.
Mm-hmm. And then on page 16, the seductive lure of socialism. Instead, it is demanded that the law should directly extend welfare, education, and morality throughout the nation. This is the seductive lure of socialism. A citizen cannot at the same time be free and not free. So like you were saying, if we want to get rid of socialism, we have to go after the schools. Think about it. They're in there for 13 years, conditioned. Every single day they go in, they're like, oh, I guess I need the government for education. That's 13 years. That's insane. And so they come out of it and they think the government owes them a lot of other things. And we're surprised at that. No, you taught them for 13 years that they need the government to provide what they want to get. They can't imagine government or an education without government. I talked to people about this. I've created the free enterprise education model, which basically shows how education would work in the vacuum of government. And people have never thought about this before. It's beyond them. And when you pound that into the head for 13 years, what can we expect more? Nothing. So then on page 18, law is force. Since the law organizes justice, the socialists ask why the law should not also organize labor, education, and religion. Why should not law be used for these purposes? Because it could not organize labor, education, and religion without destroying justice. Again, you're taking from people their money that they earn through the product of their own labor, the sacrifice of their own time and work. and you're taking that and giving it to someone else. It doesn't matter the reason. It could be the most well-intentioned reason. Still wrong. There's a meme, I think it's Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where he says, cool motive, still murder. And so I'm going to say, cool motive, still plunder, still wrong. Doesn't matter your motive. And here's the other thing too. When people say we need to have education be democratic, we all have a say in education, or that we should. This is my response to that. And honestly, I mean this every single bit. To anyone who says you have a say in someone else's child's education, who the hell are you to say you get to interfere in that person's life, that child's life, at gunpoint? If you want to say you want to support them, or talk to them about your ideas or what they should be doing, okay, fine, free speech, go at it. But the moment you you bring in the law, which again enforces everything at gunpoint, that's how it works, to say you and your child have to operate this way because it's my idea. Who are you to say that? You're nobody. It doesn't matter who you are. You're not a person. You don't have a right to do that. And in fact, it's wrong for you to do that. It's the opposite. You have no right to be involved. Got a few more points here I think we'll cover. So there's actually page 21, there's actually just a paragraph dedicated specifically to the law and education. You say, there are persons who lack education, and you turn to the law, but the law is not in itself a torch of learning which shines its light abroad. The law extends over a society where some persons have knowledge and others do not, where some citizens need to learn and others can teach. In this matter of education, the law has only two alternatives. It can permit this transaction of teaching and learning to operate freely and without the use of force, or it can force human wills in this matter by taking from some of them enough to pay the teachers who are appointed by government to instruct others without charge. But in the second case, the law commits legal plunder by violating liberty and property. Anything to add there?
No, I think I just love how straightforward Bastiat is. It reminds me of a quote of his from a different essay he wrote called "What is Money?" He says, the most urgent necessity is not that the state should teach, but that it should allow education. All monopolies are detestable, but the worst of all is the monopoly of education.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I actually had that quote I was going to read at some point, but you beat me to
I'm sorry.
it. No. Means we're on the same page here. Page 22. Socialism, like the ancient idea from which it springs, confuses the distinction between government and society. As a result of this, every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to it being done at all. We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say that we oppose to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state enforced equality. Then they say we are against equality, and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. Again, this is at the root of this is a misunderstanding of what government is, the very nature of it, and the nature of human rights. So I do not want the government in education because I want the best education for everyone. That's why I want them out of it.
But you'd think that Bastiat had been reading Twitter when he wrote this, because you see these arguments all the time of, oh, well, if you're against public education, you don't want poor children to be able to have education, or minorities to have access to education. It's like, actually, the biggest barrier right now to people, minorities, getting education, or poor people getting education, is the government and your government-controlled school system. The idea that school choice could be something that is objectionable just shows that it's a complete lack of understanding of what the problem is. And like you said, and like Bastiat says, it's not about we don't want people to be educated. It's recognizing who's the best at doing it and who is morally able to do so.
I wasn't going to touch up on school choice, but, I'll do it since we're, already talking about it. I always love it when I hear people say, oh, or parents have the right to choose which school they send their kids to. I'm like, right. So God's up there and says, parents, you don't have the right to choose when your child learns. You don't have the right to choose what your child learns. You don't have the right to how they learn, X, Y, and Z, and on and on. But you have the right to choose which government schools bureaucrats provided for you. You're telling me that's how God ordered the rights? No, that's ridiculous. And again, this idea that it'll create competition. Oh no, we get to choose between this sucky government school and that terrible, crappy one. You really think they're going to close down one because everyone wants to transfer to the other? And let's say that they do. Well, now you're left with everyone in one government school. Where's this competition coming from? In the private schools, they have to follow government regulations. For the most part, private schools are just carbon copies of government schools. And you say, oh, there's differences. And sure, minute, but, 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, August to May, science, history, social studies, math, in this order, in these time blocks, done by these certified teachers. It's all the same. There's no competition in school choice. It's an illusion.
And that's the thing is school choice should mean when and where and who completely in terms of education. And the whole idea of compulsory education and these truancy laws, I don't know how you can conclude that if I knew my neighbor wasn't taking his kid to school, but I was teaching him at home, or even if he wasn't teaching him at home, would I have the right to grab my rifle and go over to his house and force him to teach, or take him by force to my house to some other place to teach him? Obviously not. That would be kidnapping. That would be an immoral use of force. But somehow we completely forget about that as soon as we talk about public education.
Mm-hmm. You get to choose which school we force your child to go to. All right, let's see here. There's something here towards the back that I really want to make sure we get to, so I'll go ahead and skip to that. Here it is. If you go to page 45, under the Doctrine of Social Democracy. And so this is a big thing that I think we need to point out to people, and again, especially to conservatives, so they can be prepared to make these arguments. So the strange phenomenon of our times, one which will probably astound our descendants, is the doctrine based on this triple hypothesis: the total inertness of mankind, the omnipotence of the law, and the infallibility of the legislature. These three ideas form the sacred symbol of those who proclaim to themselves totally democratic. And then we'll go ahead and skip a paragraph. What is the attitude of the Democrat when political rights are under discussion? How does he regard the people when a legislature is to be chosen? Then it is claimed that the people have an instinctive wisdom. They are gifted with the finest perception. Their will is always right. The general will cannot err. Voting cannot be too universal. When it is time to vote, apparently the voter is not to be asked for any guarantee of his wisdom. His will and capacity to choose wisely are taken for granted. Can the people be mistaken? Are we not living in an age of enlightenment? What? Are the people always to be kept on leashes? Have they not won their rights by great effort and sacrifice? Have they not given ample proof of their intelligence and wisdom? Are they not adults? Are they not capable of judging for themselves? Do they not know what is best for themselves? Is there a class or a man who would not be so bold as to set himself above the people and judge and act for them? No. The people are and should be free. They desire to manage their own affairs, and they shall do so. But when the legislator is finally elected, then indeed does the tone of this speech undergo a radical change. The people are returned to passiveness, inertness, and unconsciousness. The legislator enters into omnipotence. Now it is for him to initiate, to direct, to propel, and to organize. Mankind has only to submit. The hour of despotism has struck. We now observe this fatal idea. The people who during the election were so wise, so moral, and so perfect, now have no tendencies whatsoever, or whatever, or if they have any, they are tendencies that lead down into degradation. And so this is the exact catch-22 paradox, whatever you want to call it, of education. People say, we can't get rid of government education. People don't know how to educate. People wouldn't know where to go for resources. People wouldn't be able to organize freely. Everyone would be oppressed by one of another. We're not capable of doing this ourselves. We need the government to step in. And then when it comes time for voting, then they claim to know who they should vote for to put on school boards. Wait a second. I thought you didn't know anything about education. How can you choose the right person to go on the school board or into other positions of power to choose education for us? If you don't know anything, then how come you get to make the choices for everyone? Because I thought the whole point was that you didn't know anything. Because if you did know anything, why did you need to elect people? It's this very flagrant contradiction. Anything to add there, Jacob?
I mean, it is, but the thing is, people usually don't read beyond the soundbite. They don't mind being talked down to, or they don't realize it, um, and that's why we are stuck, unfortunately, where we are. Critical thinking has been crippled by the public education system.
It has. Um, so the government shepherds and their sheep, page 48. I'll just go ahead and skip a few sentences or lines here. If the natural tendencies of mankind are so bad that it is not safe to permit people to be free, how is it that the tendencies of these organizers are always good? Do not the legislators and their appointed agents also belong to the human race? Or do they believe that they themselves are made of a finer clay than the rest of mankind? The organizers maintain that society, when left undirected, rushes headlong to the inevitable destruction because the instincts of the people are so perverse. The legislators claim to stop this suicidal course and to give it a saner direction. Apparently, then, the legislators and organizers have received from heaven an intelligence and a virtue that place them beyond and above mankind. If so, let them show their titles to the superiority. Again, people claim that left to the free market, left to people's own abilities and capacities, that we're just going to head into a suicidal direction with education. Oh, poor people, minorities are going to be oppressed. Rich people will be, there's going to be this class distinction, which again, there's already class division. I mean, you're not going to create that. It's already there. And again, that also goes back to socialism and greed. Someone else has more than me. But they say that the free market, will be overtaken by big corporations. Greedy people will exploit us and take advantage. Well, aren't the people we're putting into offices to take care of this, are they not too human with the same human nature and willingness to harm others? Or are they some, magical beings, again, with power imbued on them from heaven the moment we put them in office? No, they're still the same clay as the rest of us. They're still humans. They're still fallible, and typically more so than the rest of us. I think nobody has a problem bashing politicians, but in this point, I would like to specifically point to those who control education and make a point of saying that they'll provide something so wonderful when clearly that's a bunch of bogus.
They also pretend that they care more about your kids than you do.
Oh yeah.
One of my favorite responses I've heard to that is when people say, oh, well, I care about your kids just as much as you do. Okay, what are their names? I mean, I think that that's a wonderful response, but that's when it talks about them being of higher, nobler stuff, that's the kind of attitude that usually comes with it.
Mm-hmm. Page 50, enormous power of government, third paragraph. In creating a monopoly of education, the government must answer to the hopes of the fathers of families who have thus been deprived of their liberty. If these hopes are shattered, whose fault is it? And then a few more lines, page 51. And what remedy is proposed to this? To extend indefinitely the domain of the law, that is, the responsibility of the government. If the government undertakes to care for all who may be in want and cannot do it, and if the government cannot do all of these things, what then? So again, people always say, again, big corporations are going to take advantage of us all. Well, the government has already placed the largest monopoly that there could be, and they're taking advantage of us all. I don't see what you think that we have to lose here. So again, there's already a monopoly. There's already a corporation, so to speak, taking advantage of you. And the thing is, if we leave it to the free market, then you can choose where you go. If someone's really that terrible, then you won't give them their business. They go out of business. I mean, I don't think I need to remind conservatives how free markets and competition and spontaneous order work. I think they are well acquainted with it. I just think we need to shatter this illusion that it doesn't apply to education, when in fact it may apply even more so to it. All right, I think we'll go ahead and close up here. Last page, 58.
Sounds great.
So let us now try liberty. God has given to men all that is necessary for them to accomplish their destinies. He has provided a social form as well as a human form. And these social organs of persons are so constituted that they will develop themselves harmoniously in the clean air of liberty. Away then with quacks and organizers, away with their rings, chains, hooks, and pincers, away with their artificial systems, away with the whims of governmental administrators, their socialized projects, their centralization, their tariffs, their government schools, their state religions, their free credit, their bank monopolies, their regulations, their restrictions, their equalization by taxation, and their pious moralizations. And now that the legislators and do-gooders have so futilely inflicted so many systems upon society, may they finally end where they should have begun. May they reject all systems and try liberty, for liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God and his works. So it's time for us to stop putting our faith into government when they have so clearly failed us over and over and over again. It's time for us to put our faith in God by putting faith in the free market. And the way that works is God, you have to know God gave us all abilities, intelligences, and you have to trust that, that he did that he meant liberty when he talks about it. When we violate people's rights, that we are violating what God has given them, and that is not faith in God. Faith in God is trusting that God was right to give us rights.
It's an acknowledgement of his gift of rights. It's acknowledgement of his laws, and that's the thing is, that's the question that we have to come down to. Do we really believe in freedom, or do we not? Do we recognize what the proper role of government is, or do we not? And if we don't have faith in that, then maybe we shouldn't call ourselves conservatives.
Awesome. And again, just topping it off here with a bow. Government involvement in education is socialism. Government involvement in education is socialism. Get it through your heads, people. All right. Any last words to add, Jacob, or do you think we're good?
No, I think that's great. Thank you so much for having me on.
I've really appreciated having you on here and having this conversation. And I think that is it for today. All right. Thank you, Jacob.
Awesome. No problem. Have a great night.
You too, Jacob.
Bye.
Bye.